Hi, everyone. As Marla said, I'm Kate Friedman. I am the librarian for history at UMass Amherst, and I'm a member of the coordinating team for today's event. I am very honored today to introduce our keynote speaker, Whitney Battle-Baptiste. Whitney is a professor of anthropology and the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at the University of Massachusetts. She holds a BA in History and Secondary Education from Virginia State University, an MA in History from the College of William and Mary, a PhD in Anthropology of the African diaspora from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on community-based archaeology, which allows her to use the classroom as the field site as a space to engage contemporary issues with, as she says, a sensibility of the past. In other words, she teaches and researches about a past that is not past, which is something that we've been talking about all day here, and is an approach which is very, very relevant to the project that we're launching. So her archaeological work has included interpreting captive African domestic spaces at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Plantation in Nashville, school segregation in 19th century Boston, the Miller's Plantation site in the Bahamas, and the Burghardts family homestead, which is what she will be talking about today, also known as the Du Bois Boyhood Home Site in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. She is also the founding director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at UMass, which was established in 2009 to engage audiences in discussions and scholarship of Du Bois and related archival collections, and also, importantly, to raise awareness and promote scholarship around issues involving race, labor, and social injustice throughout the world. She has published extensively, including most notably the books Black Feminist Archaeology, which outlines the basic tenets of Black feminist thought and research for archaeologists and shows how it can be used to improve contemporary historical archaeology. And more recently, the W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, co-edited with Britt Russert, who's an associate professor of African American Studies at UMass. This book shows that in addition to being one of the foremost civil rights activists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Du Bois was also a data visualization whiz who was able to turn his sociological research into really striking infographics that communicate the reality of the African American experience in the world in that time. And they do so with a clarity that still resonates today. So in addition, she's also contributed chapters and articles to numerous edited volumes in major journals, including Archaeology and Preservation of Gendered Landscapes, Archaeology in Atlantic Africa and the African Diaspora, the World Archaeological Congress Handbook on Postcolonialism and Archaeology, Past Meets Present Archaeology of Atlantic Africa, Household Chores and Household Choices, Theorizing the Domestic Sphere in Historical Archaeology, as well as in the journals Museum International and African American Archaeology newsletter. Her keynote address today is entitled The House on Egremont Plain, The Story of the Black Burghardts. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end of Whitney's presentation. So if you have any questions, please ask them to me privately in the chat. Without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Whitney Battle-Baptiste.
Thank you. That was a very generous, very generous introduction. So I'm gonna just jump in and share my screen and appear that I know exactly what I'm doing. So let's do it. Okay. So in full disclosure, I always do plan a talk, and that's why it has the title. And then as I've been listening today to the amazing information, the amazing resources, and just the dialogue that have been going on around the two, with the two panels. It really brought me into thinking about kind of my entryway into learning about W.E.B. Du Bois as an African-American born and raised in New England, and what that meant and why that was so much different than what I expected to find out when I started to research about Du Bois. And I will be plugging a lot of not so subtle references to archaeology, because I really, really want local historical societies, as well as local museums and institutions, to not be so afraid of engaging archaeology and archaeologists. There's a lot of us in New England, there's a lot of us in Massachusetts. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we talk a lot about the power of language. So we're talking about excavating the archives. We talk about the material aspects of the kinds of artifacts that are left behind, the built environment, landscapes, churches, and all these kinds of things. That's archaeology. That's what, and that's, as Kate described, I initially came into wanting to learn about the past as a historian. And I would joke, because maybe it wouldn't be taken really well here, but I always call myself a recovering historian, because now I'm an anthropologist. But without history, I wouldn't be the type of anthropologist and or archaeologist that I am. But I do want to stress that for me, the archive, in many ways, I approach it as an archaeologist would a site. To me, it holds layers. It holds multiple stories that is much more than just what is written down. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is this house on Egremont Plain, which we also refer to as the W.B. Du Bois boyhood home site. But I want to talk about what that home site meant to Du Bois, and what I think it means to scholars looking at Great Barrington as a space to learn about Black history in the North, as well as, and I'm not going to talk about the controversy of, Great Barrington and all that. If you want, I guess that's Q&A, because I think that we need to look at the positive direction that Great Barrington has taken in terms of not just embracing Du Bois as a hometown hero in many ways, but also a way to engage a larger conversation around the Black presence in Western Massachusetts. So I would start with saying that this is a very gritty picture, but I love it, of Du Bois in the offices of the Crisis magazine. And the reason why I put this up first is because this is kind of where I want to start. I want to start a much more kind of personal journey to understanding how Du Bois, how the story of the House of the Black Burghardts is not just about Du Bois. And for me, that's what makes it so much more complex. When I first initially came to UMass many moons ago in 2007, I had a particular image of what I thought Du Bois was, what he represented for me as a historian of not only contemporary Africa, but also African-American history. And I really, and so for me, learning about contemporary Africa, and I'm talking about post-colonial Africa, and the African-American story, Du Bois was a center in that, in terms of his Pan-Africanism, in terms of him seeing the global alliance across nations that had folks of African descent, and how, imagine if we were to actually talk to each other, know about each other, and these kinds of things. So I had what I thought was a deep understanding of Du Bois, but it was really much more of a surface, probably later, more radical type of Du Bois who, yes, embraced the Communist Party, but also embraced the idea of Pan-Africanism, embraced the idea of African-American issues do not need to be African-American solely. Like the isolation works against us. And so for me, his involvement in the the Pan-African Congress was much more important to me than his involvement with the NAACP, except my understanding of his relationship with the crisis was extremely important, because the crisis is a standing archive of what Black America was at specific moments in time. And then I began to learn a lot about Du Bois as a human being. Knowing he was born in Great Barrington is one thing, but the truth is that his father was born in Haiti. His grandfather was born in the Bahamas. And ironically, I do work in the Bahamas, and lo and behold, the one island out of all of the 700 islands and keys of the Bahamas archipelago, the island that I do my research on is an island called Eleuthera. And that is the island that Du Bois's ancestors actually held land. So clearly there's a project in that, or at least a book. So maybe one day. But I want to go back to my initial feelings about who I thought Du Bois was. And so I'm going to actually refer to where I grew up. This is an aerial view. And I'm doing this on purpose because I'm not from Massachusetts. I am not from New England. This is a lovely little community. As you can see, it's very small. It's called Co-op City, and it's in the Bronx, New York, and this is where I'm from. But my grandmother, actually all of my family, both sides of my family are all from North Carolina. And I'm the granddaughter of the Great Migration. And this is, the Bronx is where my grandmother and grandfather settled. And the reason why I bring up where I'm from is because for me, I understood what the migration did for the North. I understood because my father's people stopped in Washington, D.C., my people stopped in New York. And so I understood that connection. But for me, the Northeast was someplace that was not really a center or understanding of kind of Black culture. And I'm showing pictures of my grandmother. My grandparents are on one side. Sorry if there's people blocking my grandfather. But I show my grandmother's picture here. We owned what we call a corner store, a bodega that was in the Bronx. And I know if she was alive right now, she would kill me for showing you this picture of her at work. But I show this to you because for me, it wasn't until my grandmother was much older and moved back to Virginia, where I was at William and Mary at the time of doing work for my master's, that I sat down and talked to her and got to know one of her really good friends. A bunch of her friends who had lived in New York for over 40 years, all from the South, had moved to Virginia to just be in a more warm place and away from the hustle and bustle of New York. Well, one of her friends wasn't from the South originally. She was from outside of Boston. And I remember, because I'm gonna call her Charlotte because I'm an anthropologist and never use names. But I bring up Charlotte because I would say as a graduate student at William and Mary, it was the first time that I had actually sat down and talked to a Black New Englander. And her family had been in New England for generations. And I was like, wow, okay, and just dismissed it. Well, what that does for me is it kind of allows me to connect, even though it happened, when I first started my master's and I knew this woman. It brought the idea of being Black in New England into my mind. And that wasn't what I was thinking about when I thought about Du Bois. I was thinking about Du Bois at Fisk, Du Bois at Harvard, Du Bois in Germany, Du Bois as Pan-Africanist. I wasn't thinking of Du Bois as child, Du Bois as progeny for which a whole family named the Burghardts put a lot of their energy and time and effort into his education, because he was the one that was going to get out, which I would say he did. So I happened across this photo, and we have this. I've only seen the photo on the right, and this is a clipped photo of Mary Sylvania Burghardt Du Bois, who was W.E.B., who was called Willie at the time, Willie Du Bois's mother. And then recently, I don't know if they just put it online or it's been there forever, but the left is the actual original photo that is at the Schomburg, which shows the whole photo. So in the archive, we only have like the kind of clipped version of it. And so seeing this again, which according to the Schomburg records, this is one of her sisters, I'm not 100% sure. I'm just showing it to you because when I find it, I like to share, and someone else can find out exactly what's going on. And I do remember that if you can see my cursor, like this is where the photo seems to be damaged, but has been touched up, like right where his face is. And it's really interesting to me because, again, as an archaeologist thinking about material culture, I see this photo and I'm really thinking about where they live, who is their community in Great Barrington, and it makes me think a lot, because Du Bois wrote a lot about his mother in the sense of her beauty, in the sense of her, but in some ways, I would describe describe his mother as tragically beautiful, as someone whose marriage did not work out, who suffered a severely debilitating stroke, and he helped her by doing odd jobs before school. But there was a lot more to the story of the Black Burghardts, which is what he called his family. And I was going to start with a quote. See, I completely messed up my notes already. But I'm going to bear with me because I'm going to teach you a lot today, but it's just going to be out of order. Okay. So I'm going to say this quote because I know we often hear the quote from Du Bois about growing up by a golden river, right? Which is the Housatonic, which was golden because of the lovely paper mills and all of the debris and the stuff that they put into the river itself. But I just want you, this is a quote from Du Bois that he writes about while living in Manhattan, in New York City. If one slips out the northern neck of Manhattan and flies to the left of the Silver Sound, one swoops in time onto the Golden River and dodging its shiny beauty, right now left, comes after 100 miles of lake, hill, and mountain, in the Old Bay State. Then at the foot of high Mount Everest, one takes a solemn decision. Left is sweet, old Sheffield, but pass it by stolidly and slip gently into teeny South Egremont, which sleeps. Then we'll right again and come to Egremont Plain and the house of the Black Burghardts. For Du Bois, he only spent a few years at the house of his grandparents, Othello and Sally Burghardt. They were there until his grandfather passed, and he then moved to town, back to Great Barrington proper, to attend school at the age of 5 or 6. And that it was at that point where education became what I would argue the sole focus of his mother, Mary Sylvania. We know from his telling that it was his books, it was his clothing to wear to school, and all of these things that were provided by his family, a family of laborers, a family who had benefited from the the tourist industry of Great Barrington and Stockbridge, yes, and who were employed in nearby hotels. And this was a moment that, and agriculture as well, but this was a moment where immigrants from Europe were beginning to push out and phase out the Black worker. And at the same time, there's a moment in which you have not a huge influx, but there's also a steady stream of former captives who are coming into this area and staying. And so they're from the South and they're coming into this New England environment around families that had generations of time in New England as Black folks. And I think that it's important to understand, and for me, it was important to learn as a non-New Englander that the mythology of abolition is a nice mythology, but the truth is that to be Black in New England was, as I want to say, as Joe referred to, the warning out of being forced to not be able to stay in the town in which you were freed. The movements of Black and Indigenous people were extremely truncated. They were controlled in many ways. And so the building of community meant that there had to be some kind of network. And some of the stuff that Erica was talking about are those networks, right? It's moving from finding a job in Springfield and losing that job. Where do I go next? I could try Amherst, I could try Holyoke, I could try Great Barrington, but you don't go a place where you don't know anyone. And this is a network that I would argue, or I would suggest that Du Bois's family, the Black Burghardts, were a part of this network. And for me, it opened up a lot of information that I didn't think about when I thought about race in the Northeast, let alone New England. And so I know I've been on the same slide, so I think I should move on. This is the graduating class of Cyril's high school, which is where Du Bois graduated. At the top of his class, he benefited from his intelligence. He benefited from, I would say, it's interesting because doing work in Great Barrington around Du Bois, when I first started, was an extremely complicated endeavor because everyone did not love Du Bois in his post-communist persona. And the one thing and the one area conversation that I had with anyone, it didn't matter whether they loved Du Bois or loved nothing about Du Bois, was his family, the Burghardts. The Burghardts were an established family. The Burghardts were a family that everyone knew. Du Bois's uncles both had houses. So he had an extended family that reached back way into the late 1700s as being an integral part of Great Barrington and its surrounding areas. And he, as a very smart, intelligent, and focused young man, took full advantage of every opportunity given to him in terms of the ways in which he delved into his studies. And for him, the object, for him, it was like, clearly I'm going to go to Harvard because I'm gifted and I know that I'm going to do well. But the town and circumstances shifted him from Harvard, and then he went to Fisk. But the other interesting aspect that I want to bring up about Du Bois and Great Barrington and growing up and getting older is that it is very interesting to learn about the kinds of people he would have heard about or potentially learned about, and the ideas behind, again, mythical ideas of abolitionism as an extremely white endeavor for another archaeologist, Cheryl LaRoche, who has, wow, I'm gonna have to put it in the chat because I just forgot the full title of the book. but it is about the Underground Railroad and the African-American contribution to the Underground Railroad in the Northeast, and the idea that this system of escape was well established by African Americans that could aid their fellow African folks to get them to freedom. And it wasn't just, Harriet Tubman, who was in upstate New York, but it was, potentially for me, someone that I've researched, Lucy Foster, who is from Andover. And I want to plug Anthony Martin, who's also an archaeologist, and his work on Black New England and being Black in New England, and especially Edward Bell's new book about Black history in Andover is just come out. He sent me a copy and it's somewhere here. I have many books around me. So for me, it is tapping into those stories that I hear all of you talking about are so difficult, yet I think that there's a lot more connections than we even understand at this point. And I think that with a project as amazing and brilliant as this, it is going to allow many of us who are interested in understanding the full history of New England and the full history of the state of Massachusetts and Rhode Island will begin to understand how these things connect. And the scarcity of things, I would have to argue, I think is going to shift as we focus and we concentrate and we believe that we can find these connections. I feel like I'm giving a motivational talk, so I'll move on. So here I have Du Bois at Fisk. I love to show this picture on the right because I just think that Du Bois was extremely handsome, but he seems to have known he was very handsome, and I'm just going to leave that comment right there. So he, Du Bois, I'm gonna continue to kind of talk a little bit about his life and then go back to Great Barrington. But I do think that this woman right here is very understudied, and she's very, she's so much in the shadows, we often don't know who she is. This is Mrs. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first Mrs. W.E.B. Du Bois, and her name was Nina Gomer Du Bois, and is pronounced Nina. And this is one of the few pictures we actually have of her. They met at Wilberforce. Du Bois taught at Wilberforce for a very short period of time before he went to University of Pennsylvania to do a study that became the book, The Philadelphia Negro. And Nina Du Bois was a student of his that they got married. So I'm gonna leave that right there too. So let's just not get into that. I show this picture when I start to talk about his family and his what Great Barrington meant to Du Bois throughout his life. 1899, this little boy, Burghardts Du Bois, who is in the middle, Nina is on the right, and W.E.B. is on the left. He was born healthy baby. They were in a, they went from Philadelphia, and he started to teach at Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta. And his son became ill, and they were not able to secure a colored doctor. And he could not go to a non-Black doctor. And so he died at 18 months. And Nina was never the same after the death of Burghardts. And pretty much after that, Du Bois lived in Atlanta and Nina lived in Baltimore for a majority of the next 20 years. But the reason why I should bring this up is one of two things happened. Du Bois refused to bury Burghardts in the South. He as well as Nina, as well as his daughter who was born later on, are all buried in Great Barrington at Mahawi Cemetery. And it was very important for him for all of his family to lie to rest in the place of his birth. And this is why it's a big emphasis for us to understand the significance of what Great Barrington had for this man from the time he was born to the time he passed away in Ghana. And the other thing that happened is that the passing of his son, which he writes about in The Souls of Black Folk, which is a chapter called The Passing of the Firstborn, he really talks extensively about what is life like for Black people in the North, in the South, in this nation. And it really moves him a little bit further and further away from straight science and data into a realm where he understands that there's only one way to get to freedom. And part of that is to incorporate this lovely thing called propaganda and to really push the envelope to call out racism and to really become the scholar that would write Black Reconstruction, right? Somebody who would write a corrective history that would potentially change the way it should have changed the way we teach about 1866 through 1876, but I think we're still learning about that one. So I like to show fancy pictures of the library because many people don't get to hang out in the back in the storage area. And I also, especially students, like to see his degree from Harvard. But I like to show it because I also like to say that although he went to Fisk University and received his first degree, Harvard did not accept it, and he had to then get a bachelor's again, a master's, and a PhD from Harvard. And we often just focus on his PhD from Harvard, even though he had to get 2 other ones from that lovely institution in Cambridge. So 2 years ago, all the things happened pre-pandemic, but hanging out on the left of the screen, we have Arthur McFarlane II and Jeff Peck, who are 2 of W.E.B. Du Bois's great-grandsons. And on the right is Du Bois Williams, who was W.E.B. Du Bois's granddaughter, who was raised by Nina. And so she really knew Du Bois in a way that was both intimate and familial. And this is why, for us, for me, it's extremely interesting to talk about Du Bois now, because when I first started, he was the Du Bois of the crisis. Then he became the Du Bois that had this radical moment and changed the way he did research and talked about Black New England, but he always had this affinity in his heart for Massachusetts. And you begin to learn about some of the intricacies and the importance and significance of the Crisis magazine. Dare I say, if it wasn't for Jesse Redmond Faust, who was one of the editors under Du Bois's tutelage of the Crisis, I would argue that the Harlem Renaissance would not have happened. So Du Bois had a hand in a lot of stuff, but it's when you talk to his family, it's what reminded me of me talking to my family about what being Black is coming from the South to the North. It's what Erica was talking about having living people. It's about understanding, as an archaeologist, it is not enough for me to look at artifacts. I know that there are material consequences to a past, as Kate introduced me, for a past that is not past. And I think that that's something that we, as folks who are living in this region, in this area, can really benefit from opening up the channels of communication to not just descendants, but to thinking about what our role is in exchanging these stories and exchanging these amazing histories, because there are lots of different histories that are happening at parallel moments, and someone out there knows about them. And so I wanted to show this because I've known the great-grandsons for many years, but having just met Du Bois Williams, who still has amazing memories. And it's really it's really different to hear her talking about her grandfather. It's just like, and like, oh yeah, he had a big sense of humor, you know. And I'm like, Du Bois had a sense of humor. It doesn't really fit for me, but apparently, his granddaughter, you know, understood that side of him. And I want to say that over time, with the public history program at UMass, and with David Glassberg and Marla Miller, I mean, there has been such an amazing partnership with students from history, with our own Afro-Am W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, with the Du Bois Center, and to the point where we are able to update the signs so that they reflect a longer history of Du Bois's life, which the other day, my 14-year-old son was doing a report on Du Bois. Why he picked him, I don't know. But he was like, wait, he ran for Senate? And I was like, yes, he ran for US Senate. So I wanted to throw this in there because there's so many integral, amazing parts that about his story that feature Du Bois, but to me, also speaks to talking about Black history in New England. Black history in the Berkshires is a rich, amazing history. Pittsfield alone has so much to offer. And it just seems like so much of what I initially understood about this area was only Boston, right? It was only Boston. And then I had no choice because I lived in Amherst. But then I began to understand that even if I go further out, there's even more history about this. And I always like to show our postdocs and our fellows. This was from 2018. This is the birth site of Du Bois, which is a parking lot, but at least, you know, we have a sign, so we're happy. And to think about, these are one of 3 murals that are up in downtown Great Barrington and on Main Street. And this is done by the youth. This is done by the Railroad Street Youth Project. And I say this because it has really been, a lot of the movement has been through young people who want to learn about Black history in the town that they're from. And a lot of them, as they've gotten older into high school and find out that Du Bois is from Great Barrington and they didn't know about it earlier, or no one said that to them, a lot of young people attitudes came out of that knowledge of learning about that. And why don't we learn more about him because of all the great things he did? And also his questioning of labor, his questioning of equal rights, equality. He was an environmentalist as well as someone who not only believed in equity, but something called healthcare for all. So I know that's too radical maybe. But also, and so what has happened is, this is also in Great Barrington. So then those 3 Du Bois murals have created spaces where so many young people come together and they really want to express themselves. And they're the ones that are also doing this research about a place where they're from. And so I didn't time myself at all because I went whatever. But I wanted to end with talking about, you know, this is a Freedom Day. And to be honest, doing work in places like the Bahamas and being in places like Brazil and Colombia and interacting with Afro descendants in those places, many countries have this thing called Emancipation Day. And it is something that I learned about because I went to University of Texas. I learned about firsthand being in Texas and actually going to Galveston on one of these Juneteenths and seeing what Juneteenth is was something that I did not understand as a Northerner, right? As a New Yorker, as something that was like, wow, this is serious. But I do want to stress that having a federal holiday is nice, but we need to remember that there's, you know, we need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need to focus on that. We need to focus on this wonderful, not wonderful, that's not the right word for it, but in the moment when we're thinking about freedom and we're thinking about Juneteenth and we're heading toward the 4th of July, I would also like us to remember that the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in 2021 has yet to pass. And these are moments that as we commit ourselves to understanding, and I want to point out and I want to appreciate Emma for bringing up the psychological and the mental difficulty it is to study this history, because it's not easy. But I think that it is much easier to ignore it. It is much easier to say we don't know it. But once we do know it, once we open up the books, once we find the document with the sentence that shows us that there was someone of African descent here, I think that we all become better people. We all become much more of a nation who can share, who can understand, and who can see each other as human beings. So I want to wish you all a happy Juneteenth and open for questions, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Whitney. That was great. I just want to mention we are about at the time when we are, no worries. We are about at the time when we are meant to wrap up. But if folks have questions, please feel free to ask them. We can go a few minutes long. At the very end, if you can stay, Marla Miller is going to say a few words about how you can get involved in this project. So if anybody has any questions, okay, yeah. We have a question. You mentioned Stockbridge. Any over the centuries connections anchored by place between Du Bois and the Stockbridge Indians?
Not that I know of. No, not that I know of. I also don't have a lot of information about his indigenous, like, I would be really surprised if there was no indigenous contribution to his DNA. I don't know how else to say that. As a Black indigenous person myself, you know, we're racialized as Black, and then, you know, but what's ironic, the only records we really have is usually of him trying to register or be a part of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Like he was trying to find his own family history with that. And he, you know, claiming that his great-grandfather, Jack Burghardts, was fought in the American Revolution, and that's how he got his freedom. But he couldn't actually, I think, prove it because there was no actual documentation of his great-grandfather's birth and serving in that capacity.
So more research to be done there, it sounds like.
Oh yeah. There's always more research when it comes to, you know, Black and indigenous history in this region. And I keep saying I have faith that is there. It's just, so it's projects like this that will bring small, very, you know, what seem to be disparate sources from all over. If they were to come together, it would be, I think that the documentation is sparse, as Gretchen Grzina was talking about, but it's there. We just have to be collective about it, not to sound Du Boisian, but I didn't say communist, I said collective.
It's totally true. So it looks like we don't have any other questions in the queue. So if you don't mind, I think I'm going to turn it back to Marla to wrap things up and give some information about how folks can join this effort, this collective effort.
That's great. Thanks, Kate. And thanks, Whitney. I think the t-shirt is now clearly going to say "Be collective about it." That is going to have to be the project slogan. So, you know, watch for a coffee mug near you. Whitney, thank you so much. That was incredible. It just really brought home to me, your remarks, the urgency of this larger work and the reason we need to do it all together, like that no one of us could ever dig deep enough or long enough to recover this story, but together we can all find pieces of it and put it together, and then we'll rely on other people to synthesize, and then other people will synthesize that, and it's all a collective project. So I very much appreciate that. I'm going to say a word or two of thanks, and then I'm going to explain how people can get involved. In addition to thanking Whitney, of course, I want to thank all of today's presenters who all inspired me with their various remarks and just helped us all get our head around, like, what is it that you do? Like, what does this work really look like? So I appreciate that. I want to thank everyone on the planning team, including my colleagues at UMass, Jess Johnson and Kate Friedman, Cliff McCarthy and Dennis Picard at the Pioneer Valley History Network, for putting all of this together. Our graduate research liaisons, Zoe Cheek, Charlotte Murdishaw, and Emma Lewis. Our partners in the communities that we're working with, the six communities we're deeply involved with in Amherst, Belchertown, Greenfield, Longmeadow, Northampton, and Springfield. I want to thank the publishers who helped make scholarship available to the researchers in this whole team. That's UMass Press, New England Historic and Genealogical Society, Amistad Press, and Levelers Press. And of course, our funders at Mass Humanities and the UMass Public Service Endowment Grant, without which none of this would have been happening. So we're very grateful to them. So let me just say a word or two about what's happening this summer. For those of you who weren't with us at the top of the day, this joint project is intended to respond to a lot of local curiosity about how to do this research. And so in a way, it's kind of like mass technical assistance to help people learn how to do this deep digging, because as our presenters have made clear, it's harder. It's harder to surface this content in records that weren't always intended to preserve this content. And so we're taking a collective deep dive. If you are in one of the communities that I mentioned, Amherst, Belchertown, Greenfield, Longmeadow, Northampton, or Springfield, you can reach out to your historical organizations in those communities and volunteer to join the team and to help scour documents and put these pieces together. There's going to be a lot of looking this summer and trying to pull out stories that we know and don't know. We have heard from people since this project launched who have been doing this research on their own in their community because they're passionate and dedicated to these stories. If that's you, we'd love to hear from you, because what we have discovered, and Dennis used this phrase in his opening remarks, is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And as each person contributes what they know, we can make connections across communities and tell bigger stories than we've had the ability to tell so far. So the project, in its nuts and bolts, we are creating a database. We are creating ways for people who have information to put it in a space where those connections become visible. But we are also interested in telling bigger stories from them. So there are a lot of ways to connect. And that's where you all come in. So I encourage everybody to hit the tab in the chat, which is the Get Involved tab. There you'll find a little survey form that helps you articulate to us how you'd like to be involved. Some people we envision will want to be looking at the material culture of the past because it's so exciting. But there's a big need for just moving information from published sources into this database so we can connect what we already know to what we don't yet know. And so if you're more interested in doing, keyboard work in your own home, that's great too. There are a lot of ways that we want people to connect to this project, and we are super much open to suggestions too, to take a cue from Erica's wonderful remarks. We're also trying to listen, not lead. We want to hear from the community about what it is that you think you need and how this project can support that. So I hope you'll all look at that. And then closing comment is just to say that the capstone event, where we hope to report out the progress for this project, is scheduled for October 3rd. We certainly have a vision for the kind of eventual outcome that Whitney was just talking about, heritage trail, some kind of larger interpretive agenda. Once we know more, then we want to think about how that's going to be shared and interpreted. How can we support history organizations that want to tell that story, and how can we make it available to people? So on October 3rd, we're going to share out the results of the project and launch a conversation about how we can all work together, again, to create that whole that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So mark your calendar for that, and we'll keep you posted. That's what I have today, with my heartfelt thanks to everybody on the screen, everybody who presented today, all of you for taking time today to spend with us and think about this project. Those are my closing words. Team, anybody else? Closing remarks, inspiration, housekeeping? Anything else? I'm just checking the messages to make sure I'm not missing anything. So thank you all. I think that's it for today. Go enjoy this beautiful, beautiful sunshine, and be in touch. Please, please be in touch. Thank you, everyone.